The snow from the night before still holds its shape on the roof tiles. The valley below Nagano is the color of ash and pale cedar, and the farmhouse sits at its edge, where the forest begins to think about becoming something else. Inside, the kitchen light is already on. A woman named Yuki stands at the counter with both hands around a ceramic mug, and the coffee inside it is still too hot to drink. She is not looking at the coffee. She is looking at the sliding glass door at the far end of the room, waiting, not anxiously the way you wait for news, but quietly the way you wait for something you already know is coming. The Shiba Inu is already there. His name is Kumo, and he is the color of cream and autumn rust, and his nose is pressed flat against the cold glass, breathing a small fog onto the surface that blooms and fades with each exhale. His tail is moving. Not the frantic full-body wag of surprise, something slower than that, something more certain. Then the sound comes. 3 knocks, soft, unhurried, evenly spaced. From outside on the Engawa, the dark wooden veranda that runs along the back of the house, a small brown hand lowers after the 3rd knock and waits. The monkey waits. She has learned over the course of 1 winter and 1 spring, and now another winter, beginning to settle into the mountains, that if she knocks, the door opens. Not always immediately, but always. Yuki sets her mug down without looking away from the door. She thinks about the morning she arrived. Not this morning. The first one in the deep cold of the previous January, when this animal was still small enough to be afraid of almost everything. And Kumo was the first warm thing that chose to stay near her. No one taught the monkey to knock. But she learned because every time she knocked, someone opened the door. The winter Yuki remembers started the way most winters in that part of Nagano start. Slowly at first, then all at once. The temperature dropped across 3 days in mid-January, until the thermometer outside the kitchen window read -11 Celsius at 6 in the morning, and the cedar trees at the edge of the property stood motionless under a sky the color of old pewter. The snow had been falling since the previous afternoon. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way it does when it intends to stay for a while. By the time Yuki woke up that first morning, there were 40 centimeters of it in the back garden, smoothing out the shapes of the stone border and the wooden bench and the raised vegetable bed she had covered with straw back in November. Kumo was already at the sliding door. He had been sleeping beside the heated rug in the living room, curled in on himself with his tail tucked neatly against his flank. But something had pulled him to the glass before she got up. When she came into the kitchen to start the coffee, he was sitting in front of the door with his ears forward, not making any sound. She assumed it was a crow. There were several crows that came through the back garden in the mornings, working through the snow for whatever they could find, and Kumo had a complicated relationship with them that mostly involved staring at them from the other side of the glass, while they ignored him completely. She made the coffee. She stood at the counter. And then she heard it, not the crow sound she expected, not a caw or a flutter of wings, something smaller. A high, thin cry barely above the sound of wind moving through the cedar branches. Then silence. Then the cry again, quieter this time, as though whoever was making it was running out of reasons to continue. Yuki set her mug down and came to the glass door. What she saw at the edge of the garden, where the flagstone path ended and the snow-covered grass began, and beyond that, the line of trees started, was a shape she did not immediately understand. She was too small to be what Yuki thought she was. She was sitting in the snow with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around herself, her fur dark brown and wet along the edges where she had touched the ground. Her face turned away, looking back toward the forest. A Japanese macaque, a female from the look of her, 5, maybe 6 months old enough to have been eating solid food for weeks, young enough that her face still carried the round, unfinished quality of very young animals. The troops' tracks were visible in the fresh snow. She could see them clearly, a line of disturbed white leading from the tree line across the garden, but not toward the house. The tracks curved along the fence line and disappeared back into the forest at the far corner. One direction. No return. She went to the wooden bowl she kept fruit in on the counter. A few mandarin oranges, a persimmon, a banana beginning to spot at one end, and she carried them to the back door. She slid it open just wide enough to step out onto the Ingawa, into the cold that hit her immediately through her wool sweater, and she set the fruit on the top step close to the house, away from the garden, and she came back inside and closed the door. The macaque had not moved. It was still at the far edge of the garden, still looking toward the forest, still making that quiet, diminishing sound. Kumo had watched her the whole time. He had not barked, which surprised her. Slightly, he was not a barky dog, but new things in the garden sometimes got a single short bark from him, almost reflexive. This time, nothing. He was watching the animal in the snow with an expression she could not interpret. She went back to her coffee. She did not stand at the glass. She had a feeling that being watched through the door was something the monkey could sense. Even if she could not see clearly, and she wanted to give her room to make her own choice about the fruit on the step. 20 minutes passed. She refilled her mug. When she came back to the door, the monkey was no longer at the edge of the garden. It was closer. Not at the Ingawa, not near the fruit, but closer, maybe 5 meters out from where she had been sitting in the snow again, with her arms around herself. And Kumo was at the glass. Not sitting this time, lying down. He had stretched himself out flat on the floorboards, in front of the door, his head on his forepaws, his eyes open and aimed at the garden. His body was pressed against the base of the glass, along the full length of him, as close as he could get to the outside while staying inside. The monkey was looking at him. Not at Yuki, not at the fruit on the step, at Kumo. She stood very still. The monkey looked at the dog. The dog lay still and looked back. Neither of them moved. The snow between them was 30 centimeters deep and completely undisturbed. After a long time, she did not check the clock. But it felt like several minutes. The monkey dropped her gaze to the fruit on the Ingawa step. It looked at the fruit for a while. Then she looked back at Kumo. Then she looked at the fruit again. It did not come to the fruit that morning. But she also did not leave. When the light started to shift toward midday, Yuki checked the garden and found the monkey gone back into the forest or somewhere she could not see. The fruit remained on the step untouched. She left it there. The following morning, the fruit was gone. All of it, including the spotted banana. And the monkey was back at the edge of the garden. Kumo was already at the door. He had gotten up from his sleeping spot again before she woke up. And when she came into the kitchen, he was already lying against the glass. His nose pressed to the cold surface, his tail thumping slowly on the floorboards. The monkey, for her part, was sitting 2 meters closer to the house than she had been the day before. Yuki made the coffee. She put more fruit on the step. She went back inside and stood far enough from the door not to be a presence. And she watched what happened next, which was mostly nothing for a very long time. And then the monkey moving 1 slow meter closer, and then stopping, and then 1 meter more. It took 4 days for the macaque to eat the fruit from the Ingawa step while the sun was still up. 4 days of Kumo lying against the glass. 4 days of fruit replaced each morning. 4 days of the monkey getting slightly closer each time in increments so small that she was never sure at the end of any given day whether she had actually moved or she was just hoping. On the evening of the 4th day, she was washing rice at the kitchen sink when she heard not a cry. Not the sound from the first morning, but a small, distinct chittering from the direction of the Ingawa. She turned around. The monkey was sitting on the top step eating a mandarin orange. Its hands were very precise and careful, peeling back the rind in sections, with a focus that looked almost architectural. Kumo was lying against the glass, watching. His tail was moving. Yuki did not move. She stood at the sink with water still running over the rice and watched through the door as this animal that had appeared in her garden 4 days ago as something barely surviving sat on her Ingawa in the late afternoon light and ate a piece of fruit as though she had done this 100 times before. She turned off the water. She was very careful not to make any sudden sound. That night, when she checked before going to bed, the monkey was not on the Ingawa. But in the morning, there was a small print in the frost on the glass, a palm print, 5 fingers splayed, pressed once against the cold surface from the outside. The monkey had stood at the door in the night the way Kumo stood at the door in the day. looking in. Something that had been only afraid was now also curious. Something that had been looking toward the forest was now some of the time looking toward the house. The snow began to thin at the edges of things in February. Not disappear, that would not happen for another month, and even then only reluctantly in the south-facing parts of the garden, where the afternoon light was strongest. But at the margins, along the fence and the flagstone path, and the base of the cedar trees, the white gave way to dark, wet soil, and the monkey moved a little more freely across the ground. She could now feel beneath her feet. She was spending most of her days in the garden now. Not all day she still disappeared into the forest for stretches of time, sometimes hours, and Yuki had stopped trying to track these absences with any precision. It came back. That was the fact that mattered. She always came back to the Engawa before the light got low, and she always looked through the glass to find Kumo before she settled anywhere. And if Kumo was not immediately visible, she would wait sometimes, pressing one hand flat against the cold surface, tilting her head, peering in through the spots where the condensation had cleared. Kumo was almost always visible. He had developed a habit in those weeks of relocating himself to the area near the door for much of the day, even when the monkey was not there. He would bring a chew toy sometimes and work at it methodically for 20 minutes, and then set it aside and simply lie in the patch of light that came through the glass in the late morning. He was not restless about it. He was simply present near the place where the monkey usually appeared, in the easy, settled way of an animal that has made up its mind about something. It was on the 9th day of February that the door opened in the afternoon for the first time. Yuki had been outside briefly to bring in the laundry. She had gotten into the habit of going out through a different door, so as not to disturb the arrangement at the sliding glass door. But on this day, the sheets were on the line outside the back garden, and she had no other way. She slid the door open. Kumo came out with her quick and purposeful, his nails clicking on the Engawa boards, and then going quiet as he stepped down into the garden snow. The monkey was on the fence rail at the far end. It watched Kumo come into the garden. Kumo looked at her, once a brief, direct look, and then looked away and began moving around the garden, nose down, checking the base of the stone border, the corner near the vegetable bed. The monkey watched him for a long time. Then she jumped down from the fence rail and landed in the snow at the edge of the garden. It sat there. Kumo continued his tour of the perimeter without appearing to pay it particular attention, though she could see by the angle of his ears that he was tracking every sound the monkey made. He worked his way slowly toward the center of the garden. Then he lay down in the snow in the middle of the open space, rolled onto his back, and pointed all four paws at the sky. He lay there with his belly exposed and his ears flopped sideways and his eyes half closed. Kumo held it. The monkey looked at him from the edge of the garden for a very long time. 3 minutes, possibly more. Yuki had the laundry in her arms, and she had stopped moving. She stood on the Engawa, and she did not breathe loudly. The monkey came forward. One step, then a pause that lasted long enough that Yuki thought it was over. Then another step. Then several quick ones, the way macaques move when they have made a decision and want to complete it before changing their minds. It stopped 1 meter from Kumo. Kumo's eyes were still half closed. His paws were still pointed at the sky. He did not move. The monkey crouched and extended one arm toward him. And at the end of that arm, one finger reached out and touched the fur on the top of Kumo's right paw, the lightest possible contact, barely a brush, and then the hand pulled back immediately. Kumo's ear twitched. That was all. The monkey looked at Kumo's face. Kumo's face said nothing in particular. The monkey reached out again, and this time let one finger rest on the paw and did not pull it back. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10. Kumo exhaled through his nose, a long, settling exhale, and the fur on his belly moved with it, and the monkey watched this and kept its finger where it was. It stayed there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stood up, looked back at the Engawa, looked at Yuki, and for the first time held her gaze for longer than the fraction of a second she had managed before. 2 full seconds of eye contact. Then she looked away and bounded back to the fence rail. Yuki let out the breath she had been holding. The laundry was getting cold in her arms. She went inside and put it down on the table and stood in the kitchen for a moment without doing anything. In the weeks that followed, the learning went in both directions. Kumo learned that certain movements would end the session standing up too fast, moving toward the monkey directly, making sudden sounds. He learned to keep himself at the monkey's pace, which was sometimes very slow and sometimes, unexpectedly, very fast. The monkey learned the sounds Yuki made that were not threats. The slide of her slippers on the kitchen floor. The particular hiss of the kettle, the sound of the fruit bowl being moved. These sounds came to mean nothing alarming. They came to mean eventually that fruit was coming. By mid-February, Yuki could sit on the Engawa step while the monkey ate from the step beside her, and neither of them had to pretend that the other was not there. One afternoon in late February, when the light was thin and golden and the snow in the garden had pulled back to reveal a wide margin of dead brown grass along the fence line, the monkey climbed onto the Engawa and sat beside Kumo, the way she might sit beside a troop member. Close enough that their bodies were almost touching. Kumo was lying on his side in a patch of weak sun, and the monkey sat upright next to him and began going through his fur methodically with both hands working from his shoulder toward his hip. Kumo did not move. His eyes closed completely. His breathing slowed until his whole side rose and fell in long intervals. The monkey worked in silence, finding things in the fur, examining them, moving on, and the sound she made was occasional and soft, a low chuckling from somewhere in her chest. Yuki was inside at the table grading papers she had brought home. She taught at a primary school in town, and the papers had been waiting for a week. She looked up and saw them through the glass. She put down her pen. She watched until the light changed. Then she picked up her pen again. She did not want to make it into something it would break under the weight of. It was already enough. By March, the pattern had changed again. Not because anything was lost, but because something new was added. It was Kumo who started it in the way that dogs start things, by doing something and waiting to see if it works. He had been moving around the garden in the early morning, and the monkey was on the Engawa watching him. And then Kumo broke into a run. Not at the monkey, away from her, across the garden toward the far fence and back a loop that took him past the vegetable bed and around the stone border and back to the center. And he did this at full speed, his paws scattering the last of the softening snow. His ears flat back, his tail out straight behind him. The monkey watched this. When Kumo completed the loop and stopped in the center of the garden and looked back at the Engawa, the monkey was already coming down from the step. It crossed the garden at a run. And then, without apparent hesitation, she launched herself from the ground and landed squarely on Kumo's back. Kumo took one small, startled step, then he ran. He ran a full circuit of the garden with the monkey on his back, gripping his fur with both hands. Her mouth open, her dark eyes bright and wide. And they moved through the brown and white garden at a speed that made Yuki grip the edge of the kitchen counter, around the vegetable bed, past the stone border, along the fence line, back to the center. Kumo ran it twice and then stopped, panting hard, and the monkey dropped off his back and stood on the ground between his front legs and looked up at his face. Kumo licked the top of the monkey's head once very deliberately. The monkey made a sound like something between surprise and satisfaction and scrambled up onto the fence rail. Within 2 minutes, Kumo ran the circuit again. Within 30 seconds, the monkey was on his back again. They did this for the better part of an hour. Yuki did not take out her phone. She thought about it. She decided against it. There are things that belong to the moment they happen in, and she felt that this was one of them. That something would be subtracted from it if she tried to hold it in a frame. She watched instead, and the watching was enough. And she remembered it the way you remember things you have decided to keep for yourself clearly, with all the small details intact. The cold. The sound of Kumo's paws on the thawing ground. The way the monkey's hands gripped his fur without pulling. The way Kumo ran, not because he was told to, not because he was rewarded for it, but because some part of him had decided that this was what this morning required. That was the month she also started leaving. The sliding door cracked at night. Just a few centimeters, enough for air, not enough for anything medium-sized to come through. She told herself she was airing the room, which was partially true. But on the first night, when she checked at 11 o'clock before going to bed, she found the monkey curled against the base of the door on the engawa, her back pressed against the spot where the frame met the sill. And on the other side, Kumo lying flat, his hip pressed into exactly the same place from the inside. One layer of glass between them. 4 millimeters of cold transparency separating one warm body from another. The monkey's eyes were closed. Kumo's eyes were closed. Yuki stood in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then she went to bed. In the morning, the monkey was gone before first light, back to the forest, or wherever she went in the early hours, and Kumo was in his spot on the heated rug, and the whole thing might have been a dream, except that there was a small smear on the outside of the glass at hip height, where the monkey's body had been pressed against it through the night. She did not wipe it away that morning. She left it for a few days. Perhaps because it was the only evidence, other than memory, that the two of them had spent a winter night as close as the distance allowed one layer of glass between them, sharing what warmth could pass through it, neither of them alone. Spring in that part of Nagano does not announce itself. It seeps in at the edges, a degree warmer at noon, the snow pulling back from the fence line by another half meter, the light staying a few minutes longer in the evenings, the mud beneath the garden flagstones softening underfoot. The macaque's behavior changed with the season the way it would have changed whether Kumo existed or not. It began leaving for longer stretches. A morning, then a full day, then sometimes a day and a half, the exact rhythms shifting in ways she could not predict. It always came back before dark. That was the thing she had come to rely on, not because she had established it, not because the monkey owed her anything, but because the pattern held. Evening after evening, the monkey came back to the engawa. It ate from the bowl she left out. It sat with Kumo on the warm boards in the late afternoon light. She groomed him, or she ran with him, or she simply sat beside him in the quiet of two animals that have moved past the need to demonstrate their relationship every moment they are together. And then in April, she was gone for 5 days. She did not see her leave. She just realized on the second evening, when she put out the fruit, and it was still there at dusk, that she did not know where she was. Kumo knew. Or Kumo knew something, that the monkey was not where it usually was, that the pattern had shifted, that the engawa step at 4 in the afternoon was different in some way. His nose or his body understood before his visible behavior showed it. He went to the door each morning and afternoon. He lay against it the way he had in January, and looked out at the engawa and the empty garden beyond. His tail did not wag during those 5 days with the steady confidence it usually did. It moved occasionally when she came to sit beside him, or when she spoke his name, but slowly the way a tail moves when the main source of momentum is elsewhere. Yuki found herself doing something she had not expected, sitting beside him at the door. In the mornings with her coffee. In the evenings with a book she was not really reading. She would sit on the floor next to Kumo, with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out, and they would both look out at the engawa together, and neither of them said anything about it. On the 3rd day, she put fruit on the step anyway. On the 4th day, the fruit from the day before was still there. She put fresh fruit next to the old fruit. The birds took the old fruit. On the 5th morning, she woke before the alarm, which she almost never did, and came to the kitchen in the dark, and put the kettle on, and stood at the door, looking out at the engawa in the last of the night. Nothing on the step, nothing on the fence. She made the coffee. She turned around to find Kumo directly behind her. Not at the door, he had gotten up and followed her into the kitchen, and was sitting looking up at her in the attentive way of a dog that is asking for information. She scratched his ear. She did not have any information. They went to the door together, and stood there looking out at the garden in the early gray light of a Nagano April morning, the cherry tree along the back fence just beginning to bud, the mud between the flagstones dark and visible now, the snow entirely gone. And then the knock. 3 of them. Soft, even, unhurried. Kumo moved before she did. He was at the glass in one motion, up on his hind legs, with his front paws on the door frame, his tail going in full circles, and she heard him make a sound she had not heard him make before. Not a bark, not a whine. Something low and sustained and deeply satisfied, like a sound that had been waiting somewhere in him, for 5 days, looking for the right moment. On the Engawa, in the new morning light, the monkey stood with her hand lowered after the third knock and looked in through the glass. It had not brought anything. There was no explanation in her posture, no indication of where she had been, or what she had done, or why she was back now on this particular morning rather than yesterday or tomorrow. It had simply come back, because this was the place with the fruit on the step and the dog at the door, and the woman with the coffee who knew not to move too fast or reach toward you with her hands. Because this was the place where one January morning, when you were small and alone in a garden full of snow, something warm lay down on the other side of a pane of glass and stayed. Yuki opened the sliding door. The cold April air came through. Kumo stepped out onto the Engawa, and the monkey stepped sideways to make room, and they stood together on the old cedar boards in the early morning. And then Kumo lay down, and the monkey sat beside him, and the day began. She stood in the open doorway with her coffee. The cherry tree at the back fence had 3 flowers open on one of the lower branches. She could see them from where she stood, small and very white against the pale morning sky. The macaque is fully grown now, or close to it. Her limbs are longer, her face a deeper red, her movements through the garden carrying the unhurried authority of an animal that knows this space and has no reason to be afraid in it. It comes most mornings. Not every morning. There are mornings when the Engawa is empty and the fruit sits untouched until the birds find it, but most. And on the morning she comes, the knock arrives first. 3 soft knocks. Kumo is already there when they land. Has been there probably for several minutes, his nose pressed into the condensation on the cold glass, his tail moving at the slow, certain pace of recognition. Yuki makes the coffee. She listens for the knock. The monkey stands on the Engawa in the early light and waits. And the door opens. The way it always has. The way it always will.